Welcome everybody, and I can see there are plenty of you there, to the Stimulating Private Sector Extension in Australian Agriculture to Increase Returns from R&D webinar, which will outline the key findings of the project. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and a copy of the presentations will be available post-webinar, so we will circulate that to all people who've registered for the webinar. Before we move from the title page, I'd just like you to note that with all the logos there, this is a highly collaborative project, as demonstrated by the breadth of project partners who support the project financially and in kind. So if you have a look at the screen, you will see that the Australian Government, the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, is a key partner, along with 6 research and development corporations, or RDCs. So we have meat and livestock, dairy, cotton, pork, sugar, horticulture. We have a researcher in the University of Melbourne as the key researcher in the project. And we also have 2 state governments, Agriculture Victoria and the Department of Primary Industries in New South Wales. Along with these formal partners, there have been many, many partners from the private sector involved in the project. So my name's Ian Linley, and that's me. I work with Dairy Australia, which is one of the research and development corporations, and Dairy Australia is the lead of the project, and I'm the project manager. So we're going to have a poll now, just to kick off, and again to acquaint yourself with the tools. And the poll will open, and it's going to ask a question about your role in the RD&E system. So, for example, I work with Dairy Australia, so I'd be filling in and putting down that I worked with as close as I could to a research and development corporation.
So let me jump in. So I can see that over half the people, 55%, are involved with extension, followed by about a third of the folk with research development, but we also have some policy and some education people and others. Okay. And if they type that over in the question box, we'll be able to see that.
Terrific. So thank you very much. So interaction is in a fashion working. So feel free to complete that. So we're going to start by giving you an overview of the webinar, just to let you know what's going to be happening today. We're going to be tackling 4 different areas today. We're going to have a project introduction and background. We are certainly aware that many of you are project friends or people who've been involved in the project in some of our forums and other sessions, but we'll give you a quick background to the project. We're also then going to move into a couple of meaty areas in the key project findings. So the project's been going for 3 years, so we'll focus on what's been found over those 3 years and synthesise that information. We're also going to talk about the impact on the project, or the project has had, or the players within the project, in a monitoring and evaluation and in an economic sense. And then we're briefly going to touch on post-project options, or where to next. So that's the format for the program. So the project origin, the project commenced in 2015, and in 2015 the environment was perhaps a little different to today, and so we'll just work through some of the reasons the project developed and was shaped the way that it was. So the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources, the Australian Government department, commenced a program called the Rural R&D for Profit program, and I imagine that many of you have had connection with Rural R&D for Profit projects. So those projects, so that was a new program, and they were RD&E projects to support primary industry RD&E and innovation in Australia's primary industry. So that was one of the factors at that stage. There was a trend towards increased private sector involvement in primary industry RD&E. So the trend was trending towards more involvement, and I'm sure you've all been aware of that and noticed that. There were changes in government roles. Governments were focusing on certain areas and still are, perhaps moving into more public good areas like biosecurity or welfare, etc. And they were also changing the way that they worked in extension, including working with the private sector. And we've got lots of information in the project about how governments have been working with the private sector. RDCs were looking to share private sector experiences, so the Research and Development Corporation personnel were looking to value add to their delivery by working with other RDCs to understand how they worked with their private sector. And of course, we had private sector people working across different research and development corporations. And we also had private sector understanding and research required. So it had been some time since there had been formal research, so that was required. So this project specifically was to identify practical proposals to stimulate private sector extension services, particularly to fill current gaps. So the project commenced in 2015 and is completing in 2018 at the end of June. So the project overview, and I will do this very quickly because I know some of you have possibly seen something similar to this before. The project was always intended and developed around a collaborative, adaptive and cross-sectoral approach, with the result an increased understanding of private sector engagement in RD&E as the target, along with developing some recommendations, actions, continued improvement. So I'm going to very briefly just show you the components of the project before we move to the next element of key findings. So all these factors, collaborative governance, M&E framework, an actual review of Australian and international RD&E, these types of things were at the very commencement of the project in 2015, commenced. Communications framework. Then we moved into a stage of gathering information as part of the research. So there were regional forums that I'm sure many of you have participated in, both farmer and advisor forums. So they occurred in a number of states with people from states where they weren't conducted being encouraged to participate and supported to participate. Very early in the piece, an expert panel was set up, and two of our speakers today were members of that expert panel. And they were there to recommend, diagnose and support and mentor the project and the information. And that included people from with international experience, so people from overseas were on the panel, as well as the Australian RD&E system. There were some national surveys conducted, and our next speaker, Associate Professor Ruth Nettle, will talk about the implications and ramifications of those. So they were very extensive, and they were conducted both with farmers and advisors. There were some online learning modules trialled and developed to do with extension and focusing particularly on private sector extension. So again, they will be outlined later on. 4 trials, key action research trials. 4 of those were conducted, and we'll soon learn where they were conducted and the areas that they were in. There were also national forums, so there were 3 of those conducted over the 3 years. And then we had other research and analysis that was going along as well, like an analysis of market failure, social network analysis, etc. Along with the current focus, which is really winding up the legacy of the project, some cost benefit, which Dr. Jeff Coutts will speak about later on, analysis along with M&E, international comparisons, which the expert panel undertook, and the trials, etc. So that's the framework which the project operated in. And I guess there was an establishment phase and a consolidation phase in the project. So my contact details will be at the end of the project again. So we will have the three speakers' details at the end of the three discussions. So that's me. That's the introduction to the project, and now we get into the meaty area where I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Ruth Nettle, who was the key lead researcher from the University of Melbourne, and Ruth will take us through some of the key project findings. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks very much, Ian. The research findings I'm presenting today have been a team effort and include the work of the social scientists listed here, as well as the partners. But before I cover the three main findings from the project, I'm going to provide just a little background and definitions used in the project, because it has been things that have been asked of us as we've progressed through the project, and I thought I'd cover them up front. So the first is what we mean by extension. First, we did use a very broad definition of extension, being the process of facilitating desirable change. Now, this definition's aligned more to an innovation systems thinking, rather than agricultural RD&E as a pipeline from R to D to E. In this project, extension fulfills an intermediary function that supports networks and change amongst or between research, farming, the value chain, society and others. Further, whilst extension's often attributed to public sector roles, in this project we were interested in all the people that work to facilitate change. We're particularly focused on the farm level and the people and organisations that operate or influence direct to farm, and how these people and organisations can be more effectively engaged. Secondly, prior to beginning the project, we knew that Australian Agricultural Extension Services were privatising, as Ian described in his introduction, and the degree of privatisation varied by sector, and that this mix of public, private and industry groups were referred to internationally as being a pluralistic agricultural extension system. But we didn't really know how far privatisation had extended, nor its impacts, positive or negative. So then, who are we referring to or talking about when we say private sector extension? So here we needed to categorise or have a way to categorise and differentiate the different types of private sector groups. Now, in the project, we used an internationally recognised typology of different categories of private sector in extension. Now, moving from, or anti-clockwise from the top of this picture, we're interested in the role of farm input suppliers. So generally commercial organisations providing information and services along with product sales. Secondly, independent fee-for-service advisors. These can be whole farm or specialist advisors, often charging on a per hectare or per hour basis. People like agronomists, vets, farm management consultants. So it's up to the processing companies or supply chain advisors, the research and development corporations, some have extension functions, and finally the farmer-owned information advice and support groups where farmers pay a membership fee outside the levy for learning. We're also interested in the role of government and other organisations in this system. So after that introduction, I'm now going to move to our three key findings from the project overall. So the first is that the project has confirmed the privatisation of the extension system in Australia and the importance of the private sector in supporting farmers. So those organisations that I've just defined, the people in them, were all used by farmers as sources of information, advice and support, as shown in the orange bars on this graph from the results of the national survey of over 1,000 farmers. In addition, all providers could be a main source. That's the blue bars in the diagram. Now, each sector on its own has its own particular mix of sources and main sources, and also farm size had an effect on the sources used. So, for instance, cotton farmers had a much higher percentage of farmers using fee-for-service advice compared to beef farmers, and larger farms in all sectors had a higher use of fee-for-service advisors than smaller farms. However, from this picture, it's clear that no one group has a monopoly on provision of information, advice and support. And further, we found that nor does one group have a monopoly on change. We asked farmers if they had made changes in farm management as a result of engagement with their main source. And what we found was that over 95% of farmers responded in qualitative comments about the changes they'd made after involvement or with involvement of their main source of information, advice and support. This diagram just summarises or represents the number of changes made by farmers, the types of changes made by farmers, from farm practices to changes to the use of inputs and products, to farm business changes and in infrastructure, machinery and equipment. So what I've just described so far is all positive. It's a range of people and organisations supporting on-farm change. However, we also surveyed and interviewed the advisors as well in the system. And what we found is that in this privatised system, we found that the majority of farmers' main sources, the advisors involved, are not necessarily connected to key RD&E functions. This result has come from the advisor survey. Now, this represents a risk from privatisation for the RD&E system. Here, the key RD&E functions regarding translating research for clients, input to research priorities, and developing and delivering extension, few described their involvement as strong, and 75% desired more involvement. So this leads to our second key finding of the project, that the private sector providers do recognise their important role in extension, but their current engagement, or the RD&E system's current engagement with them, is ad hoc. And what we found that throughout all the project activities, the private sector engagement really does depend on a number of contingencies. And these relate to, first of all, the competitive advantage that any engagement of the private sector could lead to. Secondly, their own capacity and interest in a particular topic or issue. And then thirdly, that the engagement needs to match their needs and expectations and also the business model of their advisory organisation. So in all, this makes it hard to engage the private sector as a group. Now, these contingencies mean then that to stimulate the private sector or engage them more in RD&E requires a sophisticated engagement approach. And not all advisors would engage the same thing at the same time. So here in the project, we trialled an approach to engaging the private sector in critical challenges in extension through action research. In these trials, we found it's possible to engage and maintain engagement. And so now I'm going to describe briefly some of the results of that engagement with the private sector. So this relates to the trials, a key part of the project. And these were action research interventions designed to strengthen private sector roles in co-developing responses to agricultural innovation challenges. The 4 topic areas that were chosen through farmer and advisor forums in 2016 involved connecting advisors in the supply chain with industry RD&E, increasing the capacity of farm advisors to engage with digital agriculture applications, creating career development pathways for new entrants into private sector advisory roles, and exploring ways to improve access and engagement of the private sector with the latest research. The overall design framework for the trials followed key principles of co-innovation that include things such as diversity, inclusion and equality, and trials were where every participant and their respective expertise were considered assets to the process. So under this framework, trial project teams were formed. The trial was sponsored, or each trial was sponsored by a research and development corporation or a government stakeholder. A project officer was recruited specifically from the private sector, and a social researcher was involved. This trial team, when it was formed, then invited participants from the private sector and other partners relevant to the issue it was tackling and taking on. the trial partners worked over 15 months to achieve the goal that they had set. So now to the trials, each trial. So trial 1 was the processor trial, and the trial participants are listed here. Now, the main goal of trial 1 was about using the co-innovation process to link processes more in with RD&E. And this was achieved by tapping into the mutual interest of RDCs and processors in continuous improvement of the supply chain performance. So as many would be aware, there's an increasing trend for processors and RDCs to be working with producers in a similar space, like the sustainability and economic sustainability of the farm business. So there's common ground. However, there was little documentation about the what and the how the processor sector was currently operating in the extension and advisory space. So this trial presented an opportunity to contribute to that knowledge gap. And in this trial, the business case, or the mutual business case, between the processor and the research and development corporations was really the aspirations for their frontline teams. So in the case of dairy, the field officers, and in the livestock industry, the livestock buyers, for them to have better access to R&D outputs to support them in service provision to their suppliers. And for companies, it meant that they were able to address the professional development needs of these frontline staff. And for both RDCs and processors, the trial provided an opportunity to understand each other's drivers and needs and seek where a mutual benefit could be derived from the interaction. So from trial 1, the dairy field officers strengthened their capabilities in managing on-farm practice change, which was the mutual goal. And that included training in managing conflict and initiating difficult conversations, strengthening and expanding their expertise networks to refer their suppliers, and having informed conversations with producers about key areas like farm business management, animal nutrition and feed budgeting. For livestock buyers, building their skills in carcass feedback systems so their suppliers are better informed about how they can improve their performance in meeting market specifications. This is a mutual goal, and it really advanced more engagement with the buyers in interpreting data, for instance, from MLA's livestock data link. So recommendations from the trial included the important role of brokering these opportunities within each processing company. And in this trial, it was the project officer and consultant that fulfilled that role. So as extension is increasingly integral to the field officers and livestock buyers' roles, this importance of brokering between the RD&E system and them, the recommendation was for this to be highlighted more and perhaps institutionalised as a key role. The second trial was about supporting the capacity of private ag advisors to engage in digital agriculture. And here in this trial, private sector advisors from diverse advisory businesses in the cotton, sugar and horticulture sectors participated. The key issue for this trial, or what the key issue that the trial addressed, was how to assess the value of digital tools and services to advisors' business. So many of you would be aware that there's a proliferation of technologies in the marketplace, and the challenge of realising the benefits of these in practice mean not just farmers but advisors need to assess the value of digital tools and services to their businesses. So a key outcome of the collective effort here in this trial was the co-development of a digital value assessment tool, a structured set of self-assessment questions designed to support advisors to address the considerations related to investing in a particular digital tool or service. Here, a number of recommendations came from Trial 2 that really speak more to the role of farm advisors more broadly in digital agriculture. So a number of suggestions were made around really requiring a formation of a community of practice of private advisors in digital agriculture, getting them involved in priority setting in this space, considering how to better support farmers and advisors through thinking more about the different types of digital ag applications, and considering a professional development package for private sector advisors. And importantly, the quote from the participant here in this trial was about speaking to other advisors from other sectors and really developing ideas that hadn't been part of what they had done before was a key outcome. So the need for scaling up and support came out of this trial. Trial 3 was about creating career development pathways for new entrants and professionals in the agricultural advisory and extension sector. So this trial explored mentor and mentee partnerships, explored how useful this model was with other stakeholders and for large and small enterprises, and also identified structural and financial implications of professional development pathways for early career advisors. So the trial really focused a lot on what the opportunities and constraints were for early career advisors in the trial and how they might be addressed. What the trial found was that early career advisors have a number of, or a range of needs around their professional development plans and opportunity to develop their skills. This is where the mentoring model employed did help and assist by having mentoring by senior colleagues and other members of professional groups. Importantly, they identified that employers willing to recognise that developing skills and client relationship takes time, and therefore there's a need to manage the expectations regarding delivery of billable hours. So overall, this trial suggested that there really is need for new strategies and incentives for training and development for new entrants. And the fourth trial, this was about addressing disconnects between research and extension that affected end user relevance. So here, and the participants are listed, the participants from the Best Wool and Best Lamb network in Victoria and the Project Catalyst group in Queensland, which are addressing Great Barrier Reef nutrient issues, developed a collaborative knowledge model to better support private sector engagement in the principal aspects around RD&E. And this is represented here. So opportunities for private sector and farmers and others to be mutually engaged in feedback around research, reviewing, adapting research outputs, developing different types of extension packages and positioning and promoting those. So the key output around the collaborative knowledge model and how that might be used in different contexts was the outcome of the trial. Here again, participants noted the value of collaboration and strong advisory involvement and networks in research design, development and extension. The brokering role again came up about the need for these intermediaries to drive and support collaboration and maintain networks that were cross-sectoral. In particular, the value of both farmer and advisor knowledge in complex and challenging areas like nutrients in the reef were really highlighted. Further, they noted that the value of integrating farmer and advisor knowledge into RD&E to ensure end user relevance was there, but that it was important to acknowledge that suspicion or hidden agendas or lack of understanding of diverse perspectives could jeopardise collaboration. And so the importance of building trust and understanding, which is what the trial was able to do by giving space and time for that to be achieved. So I've just done a quick run through there of some of the key work of the trials and some of the outputs and findings. And so overall, when we consider those 4 trials together, a number of considerations for a less ad hoc and more strategic approach to engaging the private advisory sector and co-innovation were identified. So I've only presented 4 here, there are more available, but in particular we found that effective co-innovation initiatives can be fit for business. So acknowledging the commercial context of some of the private sector providers, but still able to progress co-innovation. But importantly, this wasn't just replacing what used to be a public with private providers. Rather, effective co-innovation required a change to the business as usual approach and doing things differently. As you would have seen at each trial, the importance of investing in the role of an innovation broker in each case seemed quite critical to the outcomes. And the time frame for developing these new approaches was clear. So this led to, or leads to our final finding about the cross-sectoral experience in the project. And here we found that private sector providers saw value in cross-sectoral efforts. Now, through the forums and trials, advisors reported that there were specific contexts that were seen as important for cross-sectoral effort. So whilst cross-sectoral gave great exchange of ideas and experiences, and often in a less competitive environment, these were some of the advantages, they saw that it was particularly pertinent to consider in regional level or regional scale problems to involve cross-sectoral projects and contributions. They identified that in areas of new research or complex problems, cross-sectoral input can be very important. And importantly, in the area of professional development and capacity building, that cross-sectoral effort can help address the complexity of advisors' professional needs and can also help new entrants find their feet. And related to this cross-sectoral effort in professional development, another aspect of the project was to develop and deliver 9 online professional development modules. And these were done and piloted with 70 participants. The topics came from the advisor surveys and forums, and they were seen as current gaps in what was available. Now, 70 to 80 of some mainly trial participants and others participated in piloting these online modules over the last 12 months. Now, these modules were positively received, and a review of them suggests that this area is of keen interest by many groups and that further development is required. So some of the strategic recommendations that came out of the independent review of the modules was that it could be possible to consider having a strategic program of professional development targeted for the private sector. This might need a steering group that consists of representatives of each segment targeted. There would be the potential or to seek funding around a case management approach to co-develop this value proposition of professional development amongst different private sector groups. And the review also proposed a number of different funding model options, from user pays through to fully funded to cost sharing. So, in conclusion, across all the project findings, we can see that whilst there are some risks from privatisation that were identified in the project, pathways forward for greater engagement of the private sector in extension functions and in the RD&E system were identified and progressed. And from all these findings, a number of future action areas were developed. And for that, I'm going to hand back to Ian to outline some of those future areas. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth. Before we move on, I have a few questions here, and I think John may have some too. We've probably got time for 2 or 3 questions, specifically for Ruth. There will be an opportunity later to ask questions of Ruth, Jeff, and I at the end as well. So a question I have, Ruth, is around the trials, and it was a question around the were they valuable in informing the bigger extension research and development picture? Not only informing, but were they able to? What's the question? Were they useful in informing the bigger picture, but were they also able to focus the bigger picture onto something that was of interest to the whole sector?
Yeah, great question. I I would definitely say yes, both ways. And a couple of insights there are the role of innovation brokers and the importance of having them given the diversity in the private sector. And so that was quite common across all trials, but as we've been also talking to a number of the project stakeholders and RDCs, people already started to think around that area and how they could invest more. So overall, the answer is yes about the influence of the trials on the bigger system. Of course, they're only at a particular scale, but there are a number of insights from them that people are saying, yes, we need this type of function or we need this type of effort, and that's more at a national or sectoral scale.
Great. And I have
Thank you.
a couple
John,
of
do you have a
questions,
question?
Ruth? Yes. So, Ruth, you mentioned the DVA tool. Is that openly available for people?
Not right now. The Trial 2 team are having it independently tested, I suppose, by others that weren't involved in the trial. And from that, they're doing product development, so improving it, because there has been a lot of interest in that, and also for assisting farmers in this decision making as well. So that is one of the key recommendations from the project, that be a product that is available and usable beyond the project. And so we're still in that final sort of that development phase. So not yet.
Okay, thank you. Now, regarding the segmentation of the private providers, was the category of farmer to farmer or peer-to-peer learning considered the classic over-the-fence sharing of knowledge and giving advice?
Yeah, so again, another great question. There's limits to what I can put across today. The survey was quite extensive, and so another series of questions related to modes of sourcing information, advice and support. And very clearly there, the farmer-to-farmer learning, peer learning, came through as a strongly preferred mode by, I think, the average across the sample there was 40 to 50% of farmers. So just by having the categories of people and organisations there, that isn't saying that farmer-to-farmer peer-to-peer learning isn't highly valued. So it was just a different question in the survey.
Sure. And last question is, was any research done into the barriers that affect the extent to which farmers get involved in extension, so either directly or by using the findings, recommendations, etc.?
Yes, when considered together. So there are a number of other questions relating to how easy farmers find it to access information, advice and support, and that suggested confidence there was relatively low. So that there was demand, I suppose, to improve farm management. That came through strongly. People are looking for new opportunities in farming, but don't always know where to go. So that was one aspect where things can be, and people and organisations can be connected and linked up, then that can be a way that helps farmers know where to go. From another side, we asked about paying for advice and issues and challenges in paying for advice. And what we found there was the issues of trust and relevance and benefit came up, rather than people saying, oh, I can't afford it. So I think that's another, whether you call it barriers or just things that actually the system can actually support to help demonstrate value, increase trust and show benefits. They're things that were obviously going to help that group. That was about 40% of farmers sitting on the fence relating to what the value of paying for advice was. So there's just a couple of insights into what we might call constraints or barriers to farmer engagement here.
And thanks for the questions, everybody. There are a number of other questions that we didn't get to, but we hopefully might be able to answer it in the end. So I'd like to introduce Jeff Coutts, who was, as well as being a member of the expert panel, as was Ruth, Jeff was also the monitoring and evaluation consultant to the project, along with being involved in the cost-benefit analysis of the project. So welcome, Jeff, and look forward to your presentation.
So as you can see, there was a bit of a team of us involved in the M&E and with the benefit cost analysis, and certainly, you know, the great work that AgTrans did in that benefit cost analysis with the support from the different trial teams was really special. Well, one of the really good things about these R&D for profit programs is that they do put a lot of emphasis and some resources into monitoring and evaluation right from the start. So we, you know, right at the start, there was this call and this need, good practice in having a robust M&E plan with a log frame around it. And as a result of that, and in planning, we made sure that there was rigorous feedback from participants in all the activities. We had ongoing interviews with the program team and stakeholders around it to see how they were viewing things and what was working, what wasn't. Particularly at the end, we did some quite detailed case studies and narratives that to demonstrate and to see how people were relating to the findings and their interaction with the project. And of course, there was that benefit cost analysis by AgTrans that gave us a very comprehensive look at where this could lead and some of the initial indications of benefits going forward. So if I wanted to sum up the whole conclusion of our evaluation, was that the project really did make a significant contribution towards the long-term goals to which it was established to do. And that was to really, you know, start to get some traction and looking at how to improve the R&D system or the innovation system in Australia by bringing together the different parties involved, both public and private, different levels of the value chain and across sectors. So from what we saw and what we recorded and what we captured, you know, there was some really great insights made, some really incredible collaboration made, and starting to get a little bit of traction into making a difference in that 3 years, which, you know, in that stage of thing was really quite incredible. Now, if you look at this diagram on the side, you can see how if we really want to get to that effective and integrated national system, first of all, we need to get this extra information so we understand what's happening. And a lot of Ruth referred to was gaining that information across from through the surveys, through literature reviews, through the analysis, through the trials, etc. Then we needed to really have a national conversation about what was happening and why and what are the implications. And start to see some ways forward to make some improvements. Then, you know, we needed some commitment from different parties to say, okay, we're on board, we'll do what we can, both in our part and also more broadly. Then we need to see some actions being taken, and the more systematic and the more collaborative those actions are, the closer we are going to get to this more effective and integrated national innovation system. And those little wedges that we have on the side represent some of the case studies of some of the sectors involved in this trial, and sort of showing how they're involved at those different levels and moving towards at least some independent actions, which hopefully collaboratively into the future might further progress this improved system. And the couple of quotes that are up there on at the moment, just to showing how that extra information that was achieved through the training modules in this case and through the information on the surveys really started to help people with their understanding of what was going on so they could start contributing and get interested in it. And we found a lot of evidence of that happening through the process. Then as we sort of track down this pathway to impact, we also started to pick up from the different people involved and the different sectors involved where they actually started to prompt serious conversation within their particular organizations or sectors and specific steps that they'd taken. So we could sort of start to see that by really focusing through these different ways on the national innovation system, that, you know, traction was starting to be developed. The benefit cost analysis tried to have a look at what would that mean in terms of, you know, economics. If we really started to improve the way this innovation system was operating and the integration of the private sector, then what does that mean in dollar terms, as well as just, you know, more convenience or whatever terms? And with a very detailed benefit cost analysis, working very closely with the trials, looking at impact pathways, looking at indications that this pathway might actually yield the kind of promised results. You'll be able to see that within a few number of years, we started to see some positive returns on the money spent already in terms of what was being able to be achieved in this particular project. And that varied according to the scale of the particular project and who they're interacting with in that way. But cumulatively, the benefit cost sort of came up with benefits that were, in the order of 3.8 to 1 in the traditional benefit cost analysis. And AgTrans considered this to be quite conservative in terms of, because they were very careful to be conservative here and try to represent as much as possible the kind of benefits that could be derived from this project. They also picked up during their evaluation or their benefit cost a lot of the qualitative benefits that don't actually have a dollar attached to them. So that was quite a comprehensive look at the project overall. When we tried to sum up what we found out through the M&E process and where it got to, well, we certainly were able to conclude that the project was successful in triggering, the information that was needed to develop some interest and discussion. We're able to find evidence that particular parts of the different sectors are involved, had taken some actions, and we could see little pockets of improvement there. We also saw a general interest in trying to take this whole thing forward, because that's really what has to happen in the changing RD&E sector in the Australian innovation system. And so basically our recommendation out of that was, there's been good progress made through this project with some nice little elements and change that was starting to occur. We just need to keep that momentum up. And I think that that'll be discussed a little bit more with Ian as he looks to the next steps forward. And that's a little thumbnail of the M&E side of things. And for those who are really interested, I'm sure the final M&E report would be available.
Ruth and Jeff are referring to a where to next, or what's the future from here. So over the last couple of months, the project's been putting together the research, the stakeholder consultations, the workshop, and some of the expert panel information, and they've basically come up with, there are many options, but we've tried to categorise the opportunities for further research, further engagement, or further activity. So it's not necessarily a project as such, could well be, or it could be a couple of organisations working together, or someone taking the lead on something, or doing it in an individual RDC, state government, or private sector. So we have this, hopefully you've got that in front of you. We have some of the areas that we're heading to here. The National Working Group. The National Working Group is one of the ideas that, one of the ideas that came out from the consultations and research was that there might be some National Working Group on private sector RD&E. So it could be across government, RDC, community of interest, along with private sector organisations, including the categories that Ruth outlined of consulting firms, resellers, farming systems groups, processors, etc. Sounds a bit idealistic, but it's something that we believe that we've learned from the project, that it's all in together to get the best result. So it's some sort of overarching group to keep an eye on that process and help direct and research that area. Some of the other things that have come out, and you as an audience may have thought, gee, that would be worth scaling up. So some of the trials may well be scaled up into other sectors. For example, the digital agriculture trial focused predominantly on the plant or cotton sugar hort area, but there's interest in digital agriculture, obviously, in the livestock sectors, which is something that wasn't really considered in the trial. So There's also thoughts about using the co-innovation approach in more context. So the co-innovation approach, such as was used in the trials, looking for other models for engaging the private sector in some of the key extension functions. And so we've talked about potentially the supply chain or the Great Barrier Reef, etc., where co-innovation approaches could operate. Investing in broker roles for private sector engagement. So that's around harnessing private sector capacity in innovation. So it's not just about brokering information, it's also brokering the actual roles and that the private sector have, and connecting and brokering, which interestingly, some of the processors in the trials felt that they were actually taking on that role outside their areas of expertise. They were actually brokering information. There's also engaging specific groups. So we couldn't engage with everybody, and I think Ruth outlined very clearly that we didn't have we didn't include everything in there. And one of those that we probably would like to have done more with was product resellers and agribusiness, who came out as being a highly important player. So doing some more work with them. And then looking at business models for professional development for extension advisors. So that's to do with the capacity building modules that Ruth outlined. There's a lot of interest in those. A lot of participants in the pilots were very interested in being engaged. So there's some of the areas potentially ahead: the research and evaluation, overarching incentives, business models, impacts, constraints, enabling policies or disenabling policies. So they're the areas that the project is summing up as areas of recommendations going forward. So John, I'm not sure if you have any more questions there. I've got a question here for Jeff, but has anyone put a question in there at your end, John?
Yes, there are a couple. So first one for you, Jeff. So what were the drivers for the trial for knowledge connections, the NPV over 30 years? Why was it significantly lower than the other three trials in the order, like it was only 0.6 million, the others were 3 to 5 million? Well, why do you think that might have been?
Yeah, thanks, John. Look, Talia from AgTrans actually sent me a special little comment on that one. And she noted that the only real caveat we feel needs to be conveyed relates to the slide showing those sources of benefits. And she's saying, taken out of context, it might seem that one of the trials underperformed compared to the others, but benefits were specific to the participants in the trials, and it was more to do with the the particular number of people who were involved there. She was actually referring to trial 3, but her big point here is they're quite specific to those trials and who were involved, and really what we need to be focusing on more is the overall impact of the sum of those trials on this issue of improving the RD&E system. And so it's a bit hard really to take some of these trials totally out of context. So it wasn't that the trial was any worse per se, it was just the way it shows up here.
And Ruth, there's a comment here saying that it seemed that through the presentation, no one's really used the term extensionist. Ruth, you did call them advisors. And the question is, how can we have professional development in a profession that does not exist?
Yes, that's a very interesting dilemma. My main comment would be that from the very beginning, people were saying to us, but the private sector won't relate necessarily to extension. So in particular, for instance, the product resellers and some of those different groups. Also internationally, that there's more use of the term advisory and extension system. So I suppose we were trying to bit on the fence here. We wanted people's input and we didn't want language to be in the way. So that's partly why you've not seen the word extensionist or extension used a lot. So it was more to do with trying to get everybody's input into the project. In regards to professional development in a profession that doesn't exist, this has been a long-running debate as well about extension as a profession. What we saw is people were identifying with the intermediary role throughout the private sector, and so for that they identified the areas of professional development need, which drove the choice of module topics. So in that regard, the profession does exist. I think the issue remains, what do we call it?
Very good, Ruth. And Ian, if you wanted to just advance to your final slide showing contact details. And folks, there's lots of other little comments and questions, so thank you so much for engaging. But I'll pass over to you now, Ian, to wrap us up.
Thanks, John, and thank you very much for your participation and interesting questions and comments. As we said earlier, this webinar will be available and the website is included underneath, so it'll be available on the website, but also will be sent to all participants. I'd like to especially thank John, Ruth and Jeff for their contributions today. Jeff and Ruth particularly for their contributions to the project and the many, many people from not only the partners but other people who've been involved in this project. Also like to thank all of you who, many of you I can see names have attended our forums. So thank you very much. A bit hard to fit it into an hour. It was a lot of work for Jeff and Ruth to condense their presentations, but thanks for the opportunity, everyone, and keep in touch via the website. Thank you very much.